Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your stack of source material, all the research, the articles, the surprising facts, and turn it into pure, applicable insight. Today, we're plunging into probably the most frustratingly human experience of all, being fundamentally, agonizingly stuck.
It's that moment. You know intellectually you should change course. Could be a career, a relationship, a habit. But there's this unseen psychological gravity that just keeps pulling you back to the familiar, even if the familiar is miserable.
That feeling of being captive to your own decisions. It's funny, Henry David Thoreau crystallized this centuries ago. He wrote, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." So our mission today is to really dissect why. Why do we knowingly keep going down paths that cause discomfort or, outright failure? We're synthesizing insights from social psychology, behavioral science, and even modern therapy to understand this engine that prioritizes consistency and survival over, well, growth and happiness.
And that engine, it really starts with an internal pressure cooker. It's called cognitive dissonance. It's the foundational concept from Leon Festinger. And he basically explained that dissonance is the psychological stress that pops up when you hold two or more conflicting cognitions.
Okay, so let's unpack that with a bit more color. We're talking about a genuine conflict, right? Like my actions versus my beliefs.
Exactly. Or your feelings versus your ideas, your values versus your reality. And the key insight is that the stress, it isn't just some inconvenience. It is a powerful motivator. Your brain sees that inconsistency as a threat and just, boom, immediately moves to reduce the
It's
dissonance.
usually through some impressive mental gymnastics.
That is absolutely right. I mean, Festinger observed that humans are just built to strive for internal psychological consistency.
Hmm.
We need our beliefs and actions to align. When they don't, that discomfort is triggered and we automatically try to fix it, but not necessarily by changing the bad behavior.
But by reframing it so the conflicting parts suddenly look consistent.
Yes.
So let's use a classic example. If my cognition is I want to be healthy and my action is running a mile, those are consonant. They line up.
Perfectly. But if you hold that same idea, I want to be healthy, and then you stop for a donut for the second day in a row,
Okay.
that's a dissonant relationship. That inconsistency creates the stress,
Yeah.
and your mind just immediately starts scrambling for a way out of that feeling.
And the sources break down four main ways we do this, which are basically various levels of self-deception. The cleanest and probably the hardest route is the first one. Change the behavior or the cognition.
Which means you have to confront reality. I'll stop eating this donut. Or maybe I'll stop trying to be healthy and just accept I enjoy donuts. The problem is, often the behavior is already done, or the belief is just too core to who you think you are to change it easily.
Right, so if the behavior is sticky, we move to justification. The second method, justify the behavior by changing a conflicting cognition. This is the I'm allowed to cheat my diet once a week, it was a tough day argument.
You didn't change the action, you just changed the rule to make the action okay.
Then there's method three, which is to justify by adding new cognitions or behaviors. This is that classic mental bookkeeping.
I ate the donut, but I'll spend 30 extra minutes at the gymnasium.
Mm.
You add something to the other side of the scale to feel balanced.
And the final one, which feels especially relevant today, is the most dangerous.
Mm.
Ignore or deny conflicting information. You just reject the facts.
This donut is not high sugar because it has sprinkles, and sprinkles are protein-based. You literally create a reality that serves your action.
And we see how powerful this is in that classic study, the $1 versus $20 induced compliance study by Festinger and Carl Smith.
Oh, this experiment is just a masterclass in how easily the brain changes its own reality to get that consistency.
So to remind you what happened, participants did an incredibly dull, tedious task, turning wooden pegs, things like that. After they finished, they were asked to lie to the next subject and tell them the task was actually interesting and fun.
And the twist was the compensation. One group got paid $20 to lie, a substantial amount.
But the other group, they were only paid $1.
Now, the $20 group had an easy out, an external justification.
Yeah, I told a little lie, but for $20, it's a good reason. Their dissonance was low.
Right. I'm still a truthful person. I was just paid well for a small fib.
But the group that only got paid $1, that single dollar was not enough external justification for lying. So the cognition, I told a pointless lie, was just massively dissonant with, I am a truthful, reasonable person. That discomfort was so powerful they couldn't stand it.
So they did something incredible. They were compelled to internalize the lie. They actually convinced themselves after the fact that the peg-turning task was interesting.
Their mind decided it was less painful to literally change their perception of reality than to admit they'd been manipulated for almost nothing.
It's pure rationalization. It's why we cling to beliefs long after they've been proven wrong. It's the psychological version of Aesop's fox and the grapes. Absolutely. The fox can't reach the grapes he wants, so instead of processing that failure, he just decides they must be sour anyway. Problem solved. Dissonance gone.
And what's fascinating here is how this internal drive for comfort manifests externally. The sources call it selective exposure.
Which is a huge deal. That psychological discomfort, that dissonance, it drives us to actively avoid information that contradicts what we believe. And at the same time, we only seek out things that reinforce our beliefs.
Creating these powerful echo chambers, we choose our media, our friends, our info sources to minimize the chance that our current reality will be challenged.
Exactly. If I believe a certain political outcome is good, I will, primarily seek out news that reinforces that, even if the sources are questionable. The feeling of being right is just more psychologically rewarding than the feeling of being challenged.
It's the brain's way of keeping the internal system running smoothly, even if that means ignoring objective facts. And that internal lie, convincing yourself a bad situation, is good. That is the necessary first step for the next big behavioral trap: escalation of commitment.
Yes. If we can convince ourselves we like turning pegs for $1, what happens when we've spent years on a failing relationship or a failing business?
That internal justification explodes into really costly external action.
Escalation of commitment, or EOC, is that pattern of continuing to invest significant, irrecoverable resources, time, money, effort, into a failing course of action. And you do this despite mounting objective evidence that is just not going to succeed. It's the sunk cost fallacy writ large.
And researchers call this truly irrational because it just violates standard economic thinking. The mantra should be, if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging.
But we keep digging harder, don't we?
So why is that psychological pull so strong?
Well, one of the strongest drivers is personal responsibility, the ego threat. If you're the one personally responsible for the initial decision, it was your idea, your money, you are far more likely to double down. Escalate commitment. You're trying to justify your past actions and avoid the shame of admitting a mistake.
So if I was the executive who greenlit the multi-million-dollar disaster project 3 years ago,
Oh, yeah.
I am absolutely the last person who should be deciding whether to pull the plug. My whole career identity is riding on its success.
That is the management insight right there. People under that kind of ego threat, they tend to view current problems as having unstable reasons. It's just a temporary market fluctuation, it'll turn around.
Instead of admitting a stable, irreversible failure.
They're investing in self-justification, not future success.
Another interesting driver is simply proximity to completion. We place more value on projects when they're near the beginning or, critically, near the very end.
That I'm so close I can't quit now feeling. It prompts so much risk-taking because the psychological sunk cost feels almost complete. Even if the last 10% of the project costs more than the first 90, the brain just pushes you forward.
Valuing the feeling of finishing over the actual cost of finishing. And this has had staggering high-stakes consequences. The sources point to the Vietnam War and a really chilling warning from diplomat George Ball in 1965.
Ball's memo to President Johnson was a direct warning about this exact escalation trap. He said that committing a large number of troops would start a, quote, well-nigh irreversible process.
What he meant was that the commitment, the sunk cost of lives and national treasure, would become so great that the nation couldn't withdraw without this massive national humiliation.
Right. Regardless of whether they were achieving the initial objectives, the decision-making would be driven by justifying past sacrifices, not by current strategy. A tragic, perfect example of the sunk cost fallacy on a geopolitical scale.
And we see that same kind of rigidity in organizations. Pan Am is the classic business case.
Pan Am's collapse was massively accelerated by structural inertia. They were just so dedicated to maintaining the identity of being this globe-spanning flagship airline. When deregulation hit them hard financially, they started selling off the successful parts of their business, their hotels, their internal systems, just to keep the airline flying.
Wait, they sacrificed the parts that were making money?
Precisely. To save the image of the failing core. Their commitment to their perceived identity, what Pan Am is, was a stronger psychological driver than profit, or even survival.
That structural inertia leads us right to the role of identity in our quiet desperation. I mean, the brain's core agenda isn't happiness, it's survival, existence, and crucially, conserving energy.
That is the key insight that connects all of these threads. Your body is wired to conserve effort. Changing your life, finding a new job, breaking a toxic habit, that's the mental equivalent of running a marathon. It requires huge amounts of psychological energy.
So staying in a familiar, even painful rut is actually the brain's default. It's the path of least resistance. It ensures existence with minimal energy use, which the subconscious mind thinks is safety.
And that's why identity becomes the ultimate barrier. There's a psychological principle here. The more something threatens your identity, the more you will avoid it. It is easier to cling to a negative self-concept, I'm someone who is disorganized or I'm not good at relationships, than to face the unpredictable cost of real change.
It's a painful comfort. You know what it means to be the disorganized person. And even though that definition causes you pain, the risk of becoming the unknown, maybe organized but potentially failing person, that feels scarier.
And that fear of the unknown leads us to one of the most damaging forms of persistence, the traumatic bonding trap in unhealthy relationships.
This is a really strong emotional attachment that develops in relationships that have a significant power imbalance and a key behavioral mechanism: intermittent reinforcement.
We have to understand intermittent reinforcement first. Think about checking your phone or pulling a slot machine lever. If you got a jackpot every single time, the behavior is reinforced, but it would plateau.
But if you only get a reward sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
randomly, sporadically, that unpredictable schedule makes the behavior highly persistent. You keep pulling that lever because the possibility of a reward is always there.
Now apply that to an unhealthy relationship. Sporadic gestures of affection mixed with long periods of neglect or indifference. Those random positive moments get exponentially magnified.
So the victim magnifies these minimal, unpredictable gestures, a single kind word after weeks of silence, to keep alive the belief that a consistent connection is possible. They get addicted to the hope of the reward.
And it locks them into this relentless cycle of hope and disillusionment, all driven by that deep need for consistency and justification. It must be worth it because I've invested so much.
And we also see dissonance pop up when our life of quiet desperation gets confronted by someone else who's actually chosen growth. The anecdote in the source material about the man who ghosted his successful friend is so telling.
Right. The man was stuck in his miserable routine, justifying his stagnation. He runs into an old friend who's made huge life changes, seems healthy, happy. The successful friend reaches out, and the stuck man just avoids him, ghosts him, and even feels annoyed by him.
Why reject someone who's genuinely trying to help you?
Because the friend's purposeful life exposed the stuck man's own shame and fear. The friend's joy was living proof that change was possible, and that proof was just too painful to look at. It generated this intense cognitive dissonance that the stuck man could only resolve by removing the source of it, removing the friend.
That makes perfect sense. The friend wasn't the threat. The possibility of change they represented was the threat, a threat to his carefully constructed identity of quiet desperation.
Which brings us to the final question. How do you stop the cycle? How do you escape this gravitational pull?
The problem is, when we're faced with this conflict, most of us fall into this ineffective middle path. We don't change, and we don't let go.
Instead, we ruminate, we analyze, we worry, we try to think our way out of a behavioral problem. We hope a third, easier path will just magically appear.
One that doesn't require confronting the sunk cost or the identity threat.
Exactly. And that just keeps us spinning our wheels. This is where acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, provides a structured way to break that cycle.
And ACT is really interesting because it focuses on a completely different strategy. Instead of trying to argue with a difficult thought, which the $1 study shows is almost impossible, ACT focuses on changing your relationship to that thought.
It's not about eliminating the internal noise. It's about reducing its power over your actions. The paradigm for learning to let go has 3 essential steps. Step 1 is notice and allow the present moment experience to be there.
So, building mindful tolerance. You consciously practice befriending the difficult thought or feeling instead of just instinctively shoving it away. You can still walk up to the podium, even with the thought screaming, "You're gonna fail."
You let the anxiety sit next to you on the bench, but you don't let it drive the car. Step 2 is crucial. Assess if the experience is useful or not useful.
This shifts the judgment away from morality, from good or bad, to pure agency. Is this thought actually useful for achieving what I value?
Let's use social anxiety again. A person was bullied in school. Their mind generates an automatic danger thought around new people. That thought was protective. It kept them safe. But if that person now desires meaningful adult relationships, that automatic danger thought is no longer useful. It only leads to avoidance.
That reframing is really powerful. It disconnects the thought from morality and just asks, does this help me build the life I actually want?
Which leads to step 3, change or let go. Once you realize a thought isn't useful, you commit to effective, values-aligned behavior. You practice letting go by moving forward with the behavior despite the anxious feeling.
So you start the conversation, you write the article, you quit the job, even though your mind is still screaming about the sunk cost. The anxiety is there, but it's no longer controlling your life. The behavior changes first, and the beliefs eventually follow.
And that intentional, often painful effort doing the thing even while you feel the discomfort, that is the mechanism that lets you stop justifying the past and finally build a future that aligns with your values. It is the energy required to swim upstream.
So we started this deep dive acknowledging that we are constantly defining ourselves through past decisions, which traps us in these cycles of justification and persistence, even when they cause misery. The core human motivation for survival, for consistency, often becomes the strongest barrier to growth.
And just recognizing this process, how easily we justify the $1 lie, how much we fear admitting a sunk cost, how we cling to an identity, that is the necessary and probably most uncomfortable first step toward forging a new path.
The path of quiet desperation is the path of least resistance. If growth really requires the energy to swim upstream, ask yourself this: what behavior or belief are you currently justifying? What painful part of your identity are you clinging to, simply because admitting it's wrong would mean confronting a sunk cost that feels too great to bear? What would happen if you experimented with letting that part of your identity, that label, that excuse go for just a single experimental day?